I am really excited to be here again. Like Nicole said, I run Nourished Kitchen. It's a site about traditional food pathways, local foods, farmers markets, and kind of reviving that community that was kind of lost in the last 3 to 4 decades. So I'm going to ask you a question. Standard American diet, what is that? Tell me. Belt it out. Pizza. Burgers. Soda. Chips. Lots of sugar. French fries. Probably like this, right? Yeah. It exemplifies. More ketchup. Except with more ketchup. So it really kind of exemplifies what we consider is the standard American diet. High fat, high sugar, high salt, very, very, very processed. So my question is, how did we get to a place where our culinary legacy is hot dogs and chicken tenders? That's not really exciting to me. That's not really fun. It's not fresh. It's really, frankly, it's depressing. How many of you feel depressed by a culinary legacy that looks like this? Yeah, me too. It wasn't always like this. And it's interesting that you mentioned sodas. Root beer. Who doesn't love root beer, right? I love it. Europeans, they just don't know yet. But you mentioned a really good point. Europeans, it's not a European food, right? Root beer is uniquely North American, and it exemplifies our culinary heritage for very many reasons. So let me tell you, root beer in its origins was one of the first traditional, truly North American foods. It was a food that our colonists began to brew on their own. They would go and they would go into the woods and they would pick sassafras root. They would scrape wild cherry trees for their bark. They would take all of these medicinal herbs, barks, roots, berries that they found in the forest, that they foraged for. All of these happen to be very high in antioxidants, polyphenols. All wild fruits and vegetables and herbs tend to be very high in those nutrients. And they would put them into a big cauldron with water and molasses and maple syrup, these mineral-rich sweeteners, not high fructose corn syrup, but mineral-rich sweeteners. And they would create an infusion of these wonderful medicinal herbs with incredible flavor, with incredible plant-based power. And they would ferment them. How many of you guys went to the earlier talk on fermentation? You know how powerful fermentation is. It boosts your immunity. It does wonderful things for your gut. It improves B vitamin content. Folate content is increased during fermentation. And our colonists, our forebears, would create this remarkable drink, this elixir, this tonic, out of an infusion of wild herbs and roots and berries, and fermented in a starter, and it would be fermented into a really remarkable drink that nourished them. So what happened? Why is our root beer today so different from this concoction of wild roots and berries and things like that? Why is it? Anybody hazard a guess? Profit. Industrialization, commodities. So what started to happen until about the turn of the 20th century, people would just brew this at home. You'd always have your sourdough starter going, a ginger bug maybe. You would be able to go out and pick your own roots and berries and all sorts of things, and you would be able to brew it yourself. And then that started to shift a little bit. And by the 1960s, traditional root beer, that's root beer made with sassafras and real sugar and, unprocessed, natural, and unrefined sugars, was no longer able to be produced in the United States. How many of you guys are from the US and how many are Canadian? US? All right, and Canadian? And everywhere else? All right. So in the US, in the 1960s, there was some research done. It was industry-funded research, and it was done on saffrole. Saffrole is a naturally occurring component of sassafras root. Now, sassafras root was the primary flavoring that we had for root beer, and that's what gave it its kind of musky, minty flavor, was the sassafras root. And what they found is when you fed enormous quantities of saffrole in isolation to lab rats, they developed cancer. enormous quantities. Now granted, you would have to drink about 32 gallons a day for years of a naturally brewed root beer to get the equivalent of saffrole. But because of industry funding and profit and commodities, sassafras root, and because of saffrole, was no longer allowed to be used in root beer. So all of a sudden we went from a truly rich, nourishing, traditional North American beverage to something that was illegal, and now the only thing that was available to you was a facsimile. That, to me, this story of root beer, true root beer, exemplifies what has happened to our culinary legacy. It's really stunning. Anybody recognize this? What's this? It is a K ration. This is also a study in what happened to Americans' culinary heritage. Does anybody know why? Can you tell me why? Shout it out if you know. War turns profits. War creates an opportunity for market and for profits. Canned food was first available to Napoleonic armies, and now it's available across grocery store shelves all over the world, okay? That was the first example of how war turns profits, specifically related to industrial and packaged foods. K rations are another example. They served a purpose. You would get your tinned meat, your Hershey's chocolate bar, your biscuits, your crackers, your cigarettes, a bar of soap, maybe some nylons, and this would enable you to eat if you were unable to. You had the resources to do so, and also to trade. So the American soldiers could go overseas, mostly to Europe, and they would be able to trade for goods using things like bars of chocolate, nylon, tinned meats. And this also created an opportunity when food was scarce for soldiers to be able to eat consistently. And for soldiers who are consistently plagued with enormous physical challenges, that's pretty darn important. But what happened after the war was over? What happened to the tinned meat, to the parboiled rice, to the cans of Spam? What happened?
Got marketed to the housewives.
Exactly. And there we come to think about that. Wouldn't I be silly to make it myself? Oh my goodness, I'm just a silly housewife. You know, how anti-feminist that message really is. So that's exactly right. All of those processed foods, the war was over, the economy, we needed to find some sort of avenue to market this new industrial product. And it ended up being to our housewives. And it was marketed in a way, just like this, to one, liberate them from the kitchen, and two, to make them feel silly, to demean them for engaging in the age-old practice of truly cooking from scratch. That is terribly sad to me. That is where we lost our way. All of a sudden, all of those rich bone broths and homemade stocks that cost pennies to make became condensed soup. All of those wonderful homemade meals of fresh buttered vegetables or Salisbury steak became TV dinners. And so not only were we not cooking all of our foods fresh and from scratch, we were sitting around the new TV, because TVs were new at this time, to eat our meals that had been warmed up in the oven before we had microwaves. And so this really shifted how we looked at our food. And it was very demeaning. At the same time that we were demeaning American women for cooking at home, fresh for their families, we were likewise demeaning farmers. Does anybody else know what happened at this time with farms? They were told, get big or get out. Get big or get out. So what is the problem that we're facing today? We're facing monocropping. We're facing huge numbers of gallons of pesticides being applied all over our farms, because our farmers were told, if you want to be modern, if you want to be scientific, you better get big or get out. As a result of demeaning home cooking and demeaning traditional farming practice, which was considered not economically or scientifically valid during this green revolution where we pushed pesticides, monocropping, and the confinement of animals. All of that led us to the place where we are today, where the norm has become packaged foods and industrial-sized farms. That's not where we started, and I, for one, think it's about time we return to a culinary legacy and a culinary heritage that we can be proud of. It's time for a food revival. Who says? Food revival. Come on, give it up. It's time for a food revival. We need to go back to our farms. We need to celebrate our farmers. We need to celebrate our home cooks. And we need to know what it means to develop a legacy that we can be proud of. So I think that really starts with the farm to consumer relationship. Think about this. The USDA came out with a study a couple of years ago where they found out that the average farmer earned, for every dollar that you spent at your grocery store, the average farmer earned about 15.5 cents. So that's less than 16%, 15.5 cents for every dollar that you spent. So where does the other money go? Anybody hazard a guess? Brokers. That's it goes to middlemen and brokers. It goes to your grocery store. It goes to marketing of all of these subsidized foods, of all of these packaged foods. Because my goodness, I don't think my child who's 10 really wakes up in the morning thinking that he wants to eat a neon-colored cereal. That comes because when he watches Sunday morning cartoons, right? It's because it's been marketed to us. So all of that money, so little of it goes to the farmer. So what happens when we shift and we say, I'm going to buy straight from my farmer? They're getting close to $1 per dollar that you spend. And that's a pretty big shift for a farmer who's getting 15.5 cents. And we can do this through lots of different ways. Farmers markets, of course, is one that I absolutely love. We can do this through herd shares. A herd share is an operation in certain states in the US. A herd share is where you purchase a portion of a dairy herd and you're entitled to a portion of that milk. And that milk is typically fresh, raw, grass-fed, and you can do with it as you please. It's CSAs. CSAs are community-supported agriculture, where you say to a farmer, you know what, I'm going to commit to you. So here is a couple $100, and I get a share of what your farm produces every week for the duration of the harvest. And that really gives them an amazing commitment. And it's farm stands, those beautiful stands where you stop off and you see those ripe tomatoes and the lavender. And that's how we can really start to revive this. It starts at the farm. So up until a few months ago, I lived in the central mountains of Colorado. I lived in Crested Butte, and it was a beautiful place to live. But I didn't realize that bananas could be green and brown at the same time until I moved there, because we were at the end of the road. That means we got the last of everything. So my husband and I said, this isn't working for us. We're going to build a farmer's market. So in a town of 1,500 people, we built a farmer's market that eventually brought in about 3,000 to 4,000 people daily. That means that they were coming from other places. It became a destination. And this was a way that we spurred interest in real food in our community. Farmers markets have huge economic impacts. In a tiny inner city farmers market that in its first year, it had a $72,000 impact. In a huge market in the middle of Hollywood, it had a multi-million-dollar impact. So these markets are beginning to impact communities in very real ways. And for food deserts where people cannot find fresh foods, they go to the bodega and there's nothing but processed junk, which is a very serious issue. We now see mobile farmers markets like this one, which begin to give people who are struggling in socioeconomically depressed areas like food deserts access to fresh foods, fruits, and vegetables. And that's something that we can all affect in our communities. Market shoppers really report that there's increased food security, increased social interaction. And while you may have 1 to 2 interactions at a regular grocery store, you're having 15 to 20 social interactions at a farmer's market, which is astounding. So it's not only about nourishing your body, nourishing the bodies of your family, and supporting your farmers. It really is about building a community around traditional foods and real foods. Community gardens are another great way. This was the community garden that my husband and I worked on for a number of years, and it's such a wonderful thing. You go to the community garden, anybody can have a plot, and there you can share, you can swap, you can tell stories, you can learn about what's in season, what's not. You can start fresh, and you can really start developing relationships with other people in your community. And that's a great thing. So for the average 600 square foot garden, that will produce about 300 pounds of vegetables. A 600 square foot, that's not too big, you know? But if you split that among several families, it can really do amazing things to increase fruit and vegetable consumption and increase food security for people who are struggling. Community-supported agriculture is another wonderful way that we really can connect directly to farms. For example, you contribute a certain amount of money to your farm in advance, and every week you get a box of whatever they produce. Think about what that commitment really, really means. It means that if the harvest is poor, you are still committed to a farmer who is struggling. If the harvest is wonderful, you get to put up more tomatoes. It's win-win. You are committed to your farmer regardless of the season, and so it really provides a lot of security for farmers. CSAs are really incredible in that particular way. Most importantly, most CSAs, this is about 2/3 according to the most recent data, most CSAs are using organic or sustainable methods. And that's pretty wonderful too. They're not using monocropping because they're way too small. They can't douse it with pesticides because, again, they can't afford to. Not that they would want to anyway. But so here we have an option that really allows you to support your farmer strategically to get the food that you want to get. About 40% of CSAs also donate shares to local food banks. So again, you see that building of community and the increase in food security. How can you enact these kinds of change in your own communities? How can you enact these legacies in your communities? For us, we enacted the legacy of a farmer's market that brought a huge economic shift into the downtown. For CSAs, you can enact an opportunity for farmers to reach out to socioeconomically disadvantaged populations and ensure that even those among us who have the least resources can still nourish ourselves the best way possible. And most importantly, all of these options, herd share, CSAs, farm stands, farmers markets, help us to revitalize, to take back and to recontrol that legacy that was once lost, that was stolen from us. Because now we're in charge of the food from the moment it is grown to the moment it ends up on our plate. So my question to you is, what legacy are you going to leave your community? What legacy will you leave your children? Thank you.
You know those old spiral-bound notebooks of cookbooks from your church or local community center or whatever it may be? They went from having these beautiful recipes that were very simple and very pure and all natural ingredients and simple, and then suddenly we see Jell-O, and we see cream of mushroom soup,